Okay, so good evening. Welcome everyone to the second on the Brinck Book Award and Lecture Series lecture. We're still hoping that one of these days we will all get to see each other in person, but until then, we're really happy to have all of you here virtually this evening. So I'd like to just begin with the land acknowledgement. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, the original peoples of New Mexico Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache. Since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community wide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. And without further ado, let me pass it over to Dean Robert Gonzalez.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. A big congratulations to our two winning authors with their book awards, Catherine and Charles. Congratulations. We're so excited that you are part of the inaugural year of the On the Brinck Book Award. The award program, for those of you who might not know, is funded by the J.B. Jackson endowment here at UC Berkeley, at UNM. We were just talking about UC Berkeley. John Brinkerhoff Jackson, who his friends knew as Brinck, which is why we spell Brinck with a C, was resident here in New Mexico, and upon his death, he left us a wonderful endowment. So we wanted to offer an award program in his legacy, and some of the traits of his writing included writing in a very, very accessible way, writing in a trailblazing way, expanding disciplines, looking at the edges or at where places where folks were not really studying. And he was extraordinary in that. And so we wanted to honor him with an award and focus on books that would be interdisciplinary, that would speak across disciplines, that would expand disciplines. And so these are two of our four winners for our inaugural year. Very excited you're here. So that's all I'm going to say. And we'll start with, is it Charles, you're going to start?
It's Christine's going to start.
Yeah, I think Catherine's
Catherine's going to start.
Great.
So to give you just the briefest of introductions, Catherine Seavitt Nordenson, who is a professor of landscape architecture and the director of the graduate landscape architecture program at the City College of New York, is going to speak about her book Depositions, Roberto Burle Marx and Public Landscapes Under Dictatorship. Thank you for being here, Catherine.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks to all of you, especially to Dean Gonzalez and Kathy as well, for all of your help in making this happen. And what a great prize. And it's wonderful. I was introduced to 3 fabulous new books as well. So thanks I'm really delighted to be here with Charles, but thanks so much for putting this together. I'm going to share my screen and speak a bit about depositions. You all seeing that? Great. Different from yesterday. Just very, very briefly, I'll kind of summarize some of the thinking of the book, but I also want to I think books are interesting things. They have a life and they occupy you. And then as soon as you're done, you start thinking about them in a very different way and rethinking the premise of the book. And so in some ways, I'd like to talk today a little bit about the book itself, but also where I'm going and what I'm thinking about now in relationship to some of the ideas that came through in that work. Depositions traces a chronological trajectory. It's kind of 2 books in one, tracing the development of the public gardens and plazas of Roberto Burle Marx from the 1930s through the 1970s. And then I interweave this kind of second layer of bookness in with 18 depositions organized thematically with those gardens that Burle Marx delivered during a 7-year period from 1967 through 1974, when he was an appointed counselor of the Federal Council of Culture in Brazil. Appointed by the military dictatorship, this council of 24 cultural elites reported directly to the president and concerned themselves with all things cultural. Burle Marx's depositions were political speeches delivered orally and notably critiqued the nationalist development policies of the military regime while advancing his position as an ecological activist. Despite that inherent conflict and risk in working with the military regime, Burle Marx boldly used this position of power to advocate for the protection of the unique Brazilian landscape, and indeed the kind of construction of the culture of that nascent nation, becoming a prophetic voice of caution against the regime's policies of desenvolvimento and resource exploitation. These 18 engaging position pieces address deforestation, the establishment of national parks, the place of commemorative sculpture and monuments, and the unique history of the Brazilian cultural landscape. They're timely and fresh, despite they're 50 years old, and it's an amazing set of documents given the kind of politics of the international scene today. So here's a view of Burle Marx at his home outside of Rio de Janeiro. So the book was looking at specifically the public landscapes. Here's an image of one of his gardens, part of a larger complex at Ibirapuera in Sao Paulo. And you can see that plan here, never realized, but a suite of ornamental gardens with the flora of the Sao Paulo countryside intermingled among this canopy building by Oscar Niemeyer and built for the 50th anniversary, the 500th anniversary of the founding of Sao Paulo. And then we see work in his hometown. This is in Rio de Janeiro at the Museum of Modern Art on Guanabara Bay. This garden in partnership with Afonso Hedge, who is the architect of this building, right on the landfill on the edge of downtown Rio. And here's another view of that extension of the garden of the museum across the entire aterro or landfill of the Parque do Flamengo in Rio as well. So this is really kind of looking specifically at what happens in 1966 with the military dictatorship, the military coup, which actually takes place right in Rio, and what happens next. And I think what's very interesting is how does a designer, a thinker, a maker, a creator of public spaces, someone concerned with public culture, how does one act in this kind of government? And we see here President Castelo Branco, the first military dictator, as well as the two behind him on his right, on your left, who will become the successors in the regime. Castelo Branco appoints this Federal Council of Culture, and this is very interesting and not unsurprising, but the state takes hold of the creation of culture and wants to control culture and the definition of statehood in many ways. And so these 25 counselors are brought together as part of this council. And we see Burle Marx here with Gilberto Freire, Paulo Rosa, Rachel de Queiroz, and other elites kind of working together with this dictatorship, reporting directly to the president and speaking on a number of topics. And Burle Marx, very interestingly, takes this position of power and influence to advocate something that's actually contrary to what the dictators are doing within their idea of the construction of culture in the state, which is one of development, of cutting down native forests and planting trees that can be harvested for paper pulp for the production of profit and resource. And so there's a very interesting dialogue that takes place in these speeches where Burle Marx actually is acting contrary to the ideas of the regime and actually critiquing them directly. And I think in a situation like this, in which in fact the dictatorship is very powerful and people are disappeared and exiled, I think it's a very interesting place for him to actually take that kind of risk. The meetings of the Cultural Council, the Federal Cultural Council, took place here in the Ministry of Education and Public Health, which is the famed building by Lucio Costa and his team of young architects from the post-war period. But what's very interesting is this is exactly the building, in conversation with Le Corbusier, is constructed here with gardens by Roberto Burle Marx. This is the plaza of the building, but it's within this very building where the meetings of the Federal Council of Culture actually take place. The minister's roof garden, so again, under the Vargas regime, another presidency which turned into a dictatorship in the 1930s, under Vargas's regime, he created this position of the cultural minister. So the creation of culture was actually part of the state, the creation of the state as well. This is the very well-known gouache painting by Burle Marx of the private gardens of the Minister of Culture on that sort of lower two-level slab of the projecting volume in the Ministry of Education. But what is very interesting in the 60s, now with this formation under the new political regime of the dictatorship, is that just adjacent to, this is in the core of downtown, so we're adjacent to the Ministry of Culture, it would be on our right, but we see in this incredible plaza here, the public library, the National Library of Brazil, the opera, and the city hall all around this plaza. And at the same time, in 1967 and 68, when Burle Marx is delivering these speeches to the council and to the presidents, outside this kind of scene is taking place as well. There's also a contrary formation of a different kind of culture, which is being voiced by the citizens themselves rising up. And this is the 100,000 person march taking place in 68. Here we see again, like the construction of the Minister of War, or the Ministry of the Army in Brasilia, again, a project of Roberto Burle Marx, while a member of this council, in fact, working for the regime as a landscape architect as well. He creates this triangular plaza garden in front of Niemeyer's Ministry of the Army in Brasilia, which of course is the capital of Brazil, where it moves from Rio in the late 1960s. And this is another plan on the left of Burle Marx continuing to do a larger expansive construction and plan for that same complex. So very interestingly, he's not only critiquing some of the developmental positions of the state and the dictatorship, but he's also working for them. So there's a very complicated series of relationships that he has throughout his career, but particularly here in the late 1960s, early 70s, where he's both working for and against the regime, which is a very interesting place. But he calls out some of these key projects that we see play out in the 70s in Brazil, the Transamazônica, the pit mining, which is taking place throughout the country, the nationalized the oil and gas company, Petrobras, and the constructions of hydroelectric dams, which is the most significant source of power in all of Brazil. So these things were very detrimental, of course, to the landscape. And part of what Burle Marx is always thinking about is how is the landscape part of the cultural construction of a country and its character? And I think there's a very interesting resonance here with this question of building character that Charles explores in his book as well. So I mentioned I would talk a little bit about things that come after. And again, one of the things that really struck me in the writing of Depositions was to really think about this environmental question, like how can the rights of the environment and social rights, they're often at odds with each other, and it plays out in Burle Marx's works and his writings sometimes, where in fact he starts to privilege the environment over the social. And so I think that was one of the things I was really interested in exploring further post-book, and recently published this article in Jean Hafner's great book on landscapes of housing, which came out just this year. But I'm looking at the social housing in Brazil and Roberto Burle Marx's role in designing the gardens of those housing complexes in both Sao Paulo and Rio. And this is now the 40s and the 50s. And again, often these housing complexes were put together with the kind of pension money. So they're for workers. It's workers' housing. It's not really housing for the poor. It's a very different thing. But we see some of the designs by Burle Marx, both in Sao Paulo, here in Rio at the famous Pedregulho Gardens on the hill in Rio. But what's quite interesting is that at a certain moment, he flips and Burle Marx no longer designs any housing for, any designs of gardens for social housing in Brazil after the 1960s. It's a very interesting switch. And in fact, he starts to argue against social housing in favor of the landscape. And again, it's one of these strange conflicts where we start to see landscape preservation and environmental protection being basically pushed against the ideas of social rights and the right to housing. And here I give an example of at the very well-known and historic botanical garden in Rio. This extension that you see on the left side of the historic plan here was the nursery garden of the botanical garden, where trees were planted as saplings. And part of these areas were to be taken over by the National Housing Bank. And on these sites, public housing was slated to be constructed, essentially to give places for the many people living in the favela housing around the area. Early Marx could not be more forcibly against this idea. So again, he really kind of pushes away the idea of housing in favor of the landscape. And I think it's a very interesting conflict. Other depositions that address this, and again, this was kind of what started my head turning a little bit about some of this conflict that's unresolved in so many of his writings. Often we see the landscape being preserved so that the hills, for example, in this case of Urca, so around the Sugarloaf Mountain, this is the little cable car that takes people up to the top of the mountain, so that favelas would not be building up on the sides of those hills. So again, there's this very strange conflict between preserving one thing against another. And similarly in Rio, we often see the protests of like, why are these horribly looking buttresses, as he describes them, holding up these granite hills at the same time as they're being defaced by those who are building their homes on the hills themselves that are destroying the plant life on the hill. So again, I think I just wanted to kind of give a big overview of the book, some of its principal arguments and what interested me in the work, but also where I'm thinking next about what to make of this question of the social and the environmental. And so often we hear them paired together, but they don't often, they don't always align. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was really interesting. But without any further ado, I just want to introduce Charles Davis, who's an assistant professor of architectural history and criticism at the University of Buffalo SUNY. And he's going to be talking about his book, Building Character, the racial politics of modern architectural style.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I will also try to be brief so that we can have some discussions and back and forth on some of these issues. My book, Building Character, it's a growth of a couple of articles in ARQ, JSAH, building off of the dissertation, really on trying to explore the idea of how race and style come together. That's really how my research works in general, and looking at the ways that modern architecture has come to embody race in certain ways. So I'm just going to try and go over the general argument of the book and then give a broad overview of it and then open up for questions. So one of the things I started to realize as I was doing this work is that especially during time periods when nationalization was happening and dramatic social and political changes were taking place, there was pressure put upon modern architects to develop architectural characters that mirrored the racial characters of the groups that they served. And this was done in several ways, from the aesthetics of the building and the ornamentation of the building, but much more interestingly, by looking at the works of ethnographers and looking at the ways that spatial typologies and even structural typologies of vernacular styles could be revived from the antique past into the present to bring the spirit of the past and make it alive in the current moment. And so I'm really interested in the ways that this argument of reviving national characters, and sometimes even the racial origins of national characters, was influenced the transatlantic dissemination of European architectural theory as it came to the United States during its establishment as a settler colony. And during this period of settler colonialism, American architects were trying to invent an American architectural style that would replace the influence of Native Americans in the original indigenous lands as a new autochthonous or indigenous form of style. And so I'm interested in the ways that character then becomes a kind of cipher through which to think through this. We can look at people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and his notion of character, borrowing from the idea of Anglo character, Anglo-Saxon character, and the development of Anglo-American character. There's also lots of social theories thinking about the types of people or characters that would emerge in new cities and new developments, as well as the character, the quaint or almost functional character of country cottages and vernacular architectural styles. Now, all these things came to represent a notion of home for many people. And so I explore the way in this book that the paradigm of architectural organicism was founded on a belief that the physical appearances of race in nature and style in art were regulated by a common set of organizational principles in nature. And these were, at least among the architectural theorists that I look at in this book, Viollet-le-Duc in France, Gottfried Semper in Germany, Louis Sullivan and William Lescaz in the United States, they're all looking at a way of trying to update the Vitruvian notion of architecture as based on nature or a natural principle. And so they're looking to the modern sciences to do this. And as a result of the emergence of racialized language, we start to see how the rhetoric in architecture starts to reflect this as well. For me, one of the principal models of change that brought architects to think about style in a racialized way was a study of type categories in the sciences. From Linnaeus's study of botanical systems and the way that things looked physically, to the study of ethnography and ethnology. And if you notice in this middle diagram, you not only get the categorization of peoples based on skin color and geography, but you also see in the background some of their architectural settings as if they were natural outgrowths of certain ways of living. And then, of course, in the very far right diagram, you get architects like Viollet-le-Duc who combine these histories into a kind of meta-narrative of architectural development, particularly in his interest in the development in France itself, moving from what he called the primitive hut of different groups of people, this one being represented by the Dacius people, kind of early progenitor of so-called Asian groups. He's looking at Aryan man and other forms of primitive dwellings. You'd also get illustrations like this one, where you have at the very top a kind of display of human racial differences. But underneath that, at least for the 19th century scientists, a look at the structure of the human body, the skull, the skeleton, the thing that actually gives it its form and tells us a little bit more about the origins of these different groups. And so the idea of the facial angle being geographically distributed around the world in the same way as the different animal species would be distributed. So for those who are polygenicists, people who believe that the different human races were the result of actually being distinct species of man, nature helped to account for the differences in character and temperament that was seen around the world. And it explained things like the superiority of certain groups and their ability to conquer others, and the seeming inferiority of certain groups to permanently serve as servile members of society. And so I argue in this book that based on the racialization of scientific language, the reliance on type theory, and the interest in creating architectural styles that mirrored the populations that they served, that when modern architects updated the anthropomorphic metaphors of Vitruvian architectural theory with the organic principles of the natural sciences, race types became a privileged empirical illustration of the instinctive processes nature used to stylize living organisms. And when they went about creating design processes that emulated nature, they naturally took on some of the racial charge of the scientific language of this time period. And so visually, we should be thinking then about the transition from the divinely ordered universe that was implicit in Vitruvian man and the Vitruvian model to the ethnographic proofs that were going into the roots of architectural style in the 19th century to explain things like the origin of the column orders, or even the invention of French orders and Tuscan orders and individual orders that were representative of people's styles. And the semblance between these things now started to be ordered from a completely scientific and rationalized standpoint. And there was a desire to make architecture almost operate in a kind of scientific way, outside of the willfulness of the individual designer, in concert with the universal laws of nature. And I like showing this image because on one side we have the idea of a primitive man in the 19th century. But then on the right side, we have some of the earliest scientific rationalizations of architectural style. And here we have Claude Perrault's drawing of the column orders ascending in proportionality. They bring us from the masculine to the feminine. But he's thinking about this through scientific language in terms of 5 species of column orders, according to the methods of the ancients. So we already have the foundational idea of species thinking within architecture that allows for people to adopt this mode of design to individual national groups. And so I argue that these conceptual parallels resulted in a set of design strategies that abstracted the principles of nature in ways that personified the behavior of buildings. And we get this, what I argue is a emulation of different elements of nature in the ways that we think about the design process. So I talk about in the book the ways that design becomes a simulated process of natural selection, thinking about the partie of the building as something that is responding to its environment. And if you think about some of these diagrams here on this page, as if they were part of an animation, you could see certain parts expanding and contracting, trying to relate to its external environment in ways that an amoeba might do so, or protozoa might do so in relationship to its external stimuli. But we also get on the other side, the analysis of buildings as if they were found species or specimens in nature. The way that a kind of entomologist would take different insect species and pin them up on the wall and understand them in relationship to one another. We get folks like Durand taking buildings of a particular typology, scaling them to the same, using the same scale, and looking at them across world cultures, so that we can understand what is common amongst them, as if they were autonomous entities in and of themselves that could generate certain characteristics. And it's, for me, this element of metaphorically understanding design and nature is entwined that allows me to read the implicit human body metaphors that were created by some of the scientific rationalisms of the architecture style debates, particularly as they relate to the architectures of national groups and the national building style. So in the book itself, in the introduction, I try to outline the progressive racialization of architectural character, specifically looking at the ways that it was represented in architectural discourses, even after Vitruvianism, even after we no longer claim to believe that the human body is the sole metaphorical way of understanding the creation of the column orders in architecture, we still give bodily references, sometimes in the form of ethnographical references, like in Gottfried Semper's references to the Egyptian Situla and the Greek Hydria that we see in the top left, sometimes explicitly in references to ethnographers of the day, as we can see in the representation of Aryan man underneath. We get it in the writings of Louis Sullivan in terms of his physiognomical descriptions of his parents and his peers and Americans as a group in his autobiography, and his emulating of the use of French caricature to represent certain type forms itself. And this idea or understanding of character is something that is given to both animate and inanimate objects, organic and inorganic objects, and bridge between. Then I take folks to look at some of the ways that this thinking emerged in Western Europe, particularly in French and German architectural theory, looking at the works of Viollet-le-Duc in France, and Gottfried Semper in Germany, along the line of the Alpine, of the Alps, and thinking about the ways that Aryan migration theory, or the idea that Aryan man began at the tops of mountains, came down into the plains below, and conquered those beneath them in order to create a kind of culture, material culture and political culture for themselves, the way that architecture culture follows these elements as well. So explicitly in Viollet-le-Duc's work and his construction and design of Villa La Vedette, which is a small house studio he constructed in Switzerland, as he was commissioned to cartographically measure and map the Alps themselves. He designs this building, updating the primitive wooden hut into a modern concrete hut. And on the first floor of this building, he recreates what he believes was the prototypical state of the Alps across Lake Geneva from his house, which you could see from outside. So imagine turning around from this prototypical notion, looking across the river and looking at where your ancestors had moved. And he staged this first floor space as if he was an Aryan man walking in the plains outside, using science to unify his own position as a contemporary modern architect with that of the antique past. In a converse way, I think Gottfried Semper was very much interested in the ways that preserved mountain architectures might provide a kind of prototypical clue to what a German architecture might look like. And he's living during the age of German unification. It's divided by many religious faiths and ideals, political faiths, many language groups. And he believes that architecture, and perhaps even architectural design, based on an agreed upon origin point for the modern German nation state, might allow the architect to literally design their way out of this problem of German unification. So the idea of finding primitive huts in the mountain by both him and Leo von Klenze and others was something that was exciting for them, because it might allow for them to identify what the contemporary modern architecture might be. Chapters 3 and 4 take this notion of an autochthonous style for the national groups, looks at its translation as we cross the Atlantic, looking at particularly the birth of whiteness in American architecture in the 19th century. I look at the ways that Louis Sullivan creates an architectural theory of physiognomy as a way of understanding how character of a nation might be expressed in architectural form. And then in chapter 4, I look at the ways that William Lescaz, who is a European immigrant into the United States, brings a kind of organicism with him in relationship to public housing, in the ways that housing is to represent the masses in a way that is a homogenizing force. But within the context of the United States, with the racial segregation of public housing, his design isn't really meant for all of the working classes, but is really destined for the white working classes. It allows for white immigrants to Americanize in a way that he has done, using modern architecture, both in its architectural form, as well as in some of the murals, abstract murals that were placed in the basement rooms for PTA meetings and social mixing rooms. And all of this was a way of allowing for the social engineering of the working classes, and particularly the white working classes, those who were not from Western Europe and Northern Europe, but from Central Europe and Eastern Europe, and for some people in America, seemed to be less able to assimilate into Anglo-American ideals. So using this architecture and creating a space for their assimilation was really very important. And then in the final conclusion, I try and look at the ways that even after this moment, even as we move into the international style, there are lingering elements of this organicist thinking in the ways that we expect architecture to reflect the cultures that they serve. Even in the language and the ways that we talk about vernacularism and an assumption that there's a kind of transparent way that vernacular styles represent their cultural groups. There's been really good writing by people like Kenny Cooper that shows that this has been exploited by certain socialist groups in Germany and others to create vernacular looking buildings in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. They look old, but they're not quite old. But they exploit this assumption that we have that organicism somehow reigns in architecture. And so at the very least, I was hoping to bring a skepticism to that and to allow for people to understand how some of the language that we use every day, character, typology, precedent, that these are scientifically originating terms, that they were racially charged in the 19th century, and that it would be wise to sort of be cautious of those divisions and associations in the present. I hope that makes sense, but I wanted to just sort of do that quickly so that we could have a conversation, discuss things together.
Thank you so much, Charles. That was really lovely. So for all of you in the audience, please feel free to add some questions to the chat, but I'd like to give the authors the chance to discuss together first some thoughts they have about each other's work.
Yeah, I have a question about Catherine's work, actually, if I could. I didn't know if how long we would have for this, but I was really struck by both the content of the book and even the title depositions, like depositions as a kind of term to collect things together. Both, it has a kind of a legal parlance to it, also a notion that it's associated with the official archive. But I was interested in one of the things that you mentioned, which is sort of this designer's antinomy over time to thinking of ecology in terms of culture and not just in terms of nature, and the ways that the cultural ecology might require a kind of counter archive to counter the depositions that he was using to both talk about the landscape as a kind of natural resource and to be speaking from a kind of official standpoint. So I really enjoyed in your book these illustrations of the people protesting, the kind of presence that they wanted to bring onto the landscape. And I'm wondering in your work, sort of, how were you, or how did you find yourself balancing the kind of official archive versus the archive of the people itself, and giving kind of equal voice to those things? Just because, like, as I'm reading the book, I can imagine that there were folks who grew up on this architect and really liked what he did, and they're looking for this book to redeem him. And so I'm wondering sort of how much that factors into, the critiques that you anticipate getting, or the ways that you need to frame the book to kind of present a balance to counter that.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. So I think and I like the title too, so I'm glad you like it. I think it, like, to depose someone is to take them out of power, right? And so I think you can see so many ways of looking at that word, a deposition, and it's under oath in general, the way we use it as a legal term here, certainly. And it's evidence. And so I think there's like so many interesting ways. And at the same time, it's also things that layer on and pile on, and they even compress to form stone, So I think there's this kind of more geological understanding of how, like, the depositions of river silt, for example. So it's an interesting question. I think what I found really interesting, I think your idea of like the problem of like the official and the non-official, like what's being said, what's not being said, what's being recorded, what Burle Marx is saying, but also what the dictators are saying, like, which are often different things. And so trying to kind of find the truth, from this evidence is interesting. I think what I would say became really interesting to me was the use of the photograph. So photographic, almost like this was the visual evidence which was brought to bear on the court case, right? That this is the evidence presented was the visual. And so what I did with the book was to use only images from the period. So everything is actually a historic image. There's no contemporary photographs of Burle Marx's gardens as they appear today in their varied states of preservation. I thought that was a kind of interesting thing, is to kind of look for, like, to read images critically as well, to understand what's happening. And I think that's a really interesting phenomenon, to actually kind of look and see what is not being seen. And so again, like that idea that you're in this very refined, the exemplar of modernist architecture in Brazil, and how the world sees modernism in Brazil, like becomes like the site in which these conversations play out. And literally 2 streets away, there are people on the street, and there's so many of these really incredible contrasts that one sees. And I think what Burle Marx does, and I think, you know, I'm interested also if Robert has ideas about this as well, but I think this idea in Brazil specifically about this idea of the creation of culture, or this creation of heritage where there supposedly was none, right? I think there's some affinities with some of the work that you're looking at, Charles, thinking about how is culture constructed and how is character defined. And what Burle Marx does, which is super interesting, and he's paired in this endeavor, in fact, his mentor and mentor to many in modern Brazil certainly is Lucio Costa, who is this other very interesting character who's both working in the world of preservation and designing the most radically modern city on the planet. So I think that he works on these 2 scales of both preservation, but also modernism. And I think what Burle Marx does, which is really interesting, is he brings the ecology into that conversation about culture, that it's in fact the Brazilian landscape that is defining this new state in many ways. The landscape is part of the culture and should therefore be protected. And I think what he does in so many of these speeches is basically use his voice as witness. He's like, I've been there. I was there 20 years ago. It's not the way it used to be. Everything is gone. Or, you know, he'll have these very strong opinions about what's been lost. And so I think that he's starting to see, he's working in many ways, and I think this is interesting too, as a preservationist of this landscape to somehow kind of maintain it. And so much we hear, like, I'm also kind of just struck by this idea of, like, you know, the autochthonous architecture, like so much of what Burle Marx talks about is autochthonous plants. Like, you have to use this native flora, and we all kind of know Burle Marx is like the one who used the native flora of Brazil in his gardens, right? But there's a lot of underbelly there to really unpack. So I find that really, really fascinating as well. But I think he's also interesting when paired with people like Lina Bobardi, who are looking at other kinds of styles and practices within the country. Of course, the preservation work that Costa does is very much about the Baroque, right? So they look very much to a kind of very particular Baroque coming from Portugal as the thing they landmark and protect. But gardens are protected and parks are protected within those very early pieces by the statements by the cultural foundation of what should be protected, which I find fascinating as well, like which things are chosen, and parks and landscapes are considered part of that historic legacy. For you, Charles, I guess I have a few questions too. And I as you know, as a New Yorker, I really loved the public housing deep dive that you give. And of course, I also love the 19th century. So, you know, I can't go wrong. But I thought it was really interesting, like, is this overarching question is like, do buildings, well, how is character produced through, and what produces character? And so I started thinking, like, you know, you showed that slide with the people in the middle, the plants on the left, the people in the middle, with the little architectures behind them that are part of their character, that are kind of coming along with the way they look and their kind of dress, et cetera. And I'm just curious, like, do landscapes make character as well? Because I think Burle Marx would say definitely yes. Like, this is part of the kind of, one is Brazilian because of these places in this very, you know, essential typologies of landscapes within a very particular place. And so I thought that was interesting, and certainly alpinism, or thinking about the Alps, produces an architecture. And so you start to see that kind of lineage of like landscape, geology, place, architecture, and people. So I'm just curious how that might, if you have further thoughts on that, kind of this question of like the landscape as you think through your work, and nature comes up quite a bit in all of the analyses you're doing.
Yeah, for me, that's an interesting question because of the counter roles that landscape could play. Like, landscape seems to factor as both a natural setting against which European settlers demonstrated their mastery of nature and the landscape. And so in comparison to the indigenous subject or in comparison to non-white cultural groups, which seemed to be always in concert with nature, but never commanding nature. There are these like really romanticized mythological portraits of the pilgrim in the landscape, and the prairieman who walks ahead of the advance of cities and civilizations, and creates a kind of rustic European settler culture there as a way of keeping the place for new waves of modernization that will come in and to bring new command to the landscape. And so in one way, it both proves that the white subject can be a native subject. You know, like he goes native and thinks about that. But then within the popular imagination, there's this idea of the landscape as representing Americanness, this idea of the heartland of America or the Midwest as being this space for pilgrims or for cowboys or for the essential American subject. And to me, Sullivan is producing a kind of architectural analog to this idea of the Chicago architecture, the Midwestern architecture, that's different from the European revivalisms on the East Coast. And it's different from the native organic cultures that it replaces. Still in command of the landscape, but much more referential of the flora and fauna of it. And so he tries to do this kind of thing where Sullivan, where he's creating botanical forms that are not imitations of the Midwest, but in the spirit of the Midwest. But I think it's like super, ironic because in all of this, they all fail to recognize the relationship of the indigenous subject to the landscape. It's a way of papering over that by saying that architecture is superior in this way. And then at the same time, they're progressive. They want to actually do things like preserve the landscape or create a kind of synthetic relationship between what we take from the land and how it appears in the architectures of urban spaces. So Sullivan's architecture, I think, is one of these expressions of the ways that he's trying to give homage to the landscape in the city. He feels like it's become too urban, too commercial, too individualistic, too disconnected from the land itself. And he believes that the architect learns from nature, like just being out there. And so like him and Frank Lloyd Wright, there are all these stories about them with clients, laughing about the times when they were walking in the Midwest and picking flowers and smelling the things out there as if they were people of nature, but then never quite giving the proper homage to other national groups. It was meant to replace those things. And so I think landscape is key. But what I didn't get to in the book that I've become interested in later, particularly in people like Frank Lloyd Wright, are the ways that he uses landscape architecture to resettle the landscape. And I'm thinking of like the Darwin D. Martin House in Buffalo, New York. They actually have gone through the archives and they found some of the landscape architectural designs that he was commissioning himself and co-commissioning with others in order to take this large corner campus that he's created for this wealthy family, which architecturally makes a certain level of sense, but then is using nature, flora and fauna in order to give it a level of privacy and a level of situatedness within the landscape that I think can be studied even more. And so, I'm not real good with flora and fauna species. Like I need a whole lot of tutoring to like understand what they mean and like what they were referential of at the time period. But I do think that some architects were savvy enough on that discourse that it actually was a way of indigenizing some of their efforts in ways that I think requires further study.
Yeah. It's interesting about Frank Lloyd Wright. He worked with, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name of the landscape architect that he worked with so often. Friends of Our Native Landscape. In any case, he knew his species. And what I find interesting in that portfolio, the German portfolio, he actually often has like the plants are in the foreground. They kind of start to create the frames around those portfolio images. And they're very, very specifically chosen, I believe.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah.
You know, writing is a great example, I think, of that kind
Yeah.
of intervention.
Here's some questions in the chat. Let's see.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes. So I'd like to ask Catherine Harris to introduce her question, and then if Katia Crawford wants to kind of add hers to that, that'd be great.
Hi, thank you both so much. I really appreciated your presentation of your work, and I teach theory, so I'm always really happy when I get to bring in new readings and exciting ideas for my students and references. Only one of them is here, but I'm really grateful that she is. But I wanted to ask, I was interested, just the spatial, the kind of discussion that you had about the idea that Roberta Burleigh Marx was seeing housing, the encroaching of housing on this, you know, not really natural, but say green space where you're growing plants out. So it's neither the hillsides that you were quoting or you know, sort of natural spaces, but the idea that this is a contradiction of an ecological good to provide housing, to provide social space, and sort of to provide a city. And it seemed like that kind of an idea of an opposition, in a sense, was actually very McCargian. So, you know, if you think about Ian McCargan, his television shows and movies and things about how people are really very analogous to rats. And there's a kind of, you know, when you look at his work trying to protect watersheds and having potentially an incidental, but potentially an intended kind of landed gentry effect in the outskirts of towns and cities as he sort of saw fit. I just wondered if you were thinking about that kind of sort of dialectical opposition that is potentially being healed in some way through landscape architecture. And
Yeah.
Katya, go.
Add on. Yes, you're right. It's Jensen. Thank you, Katya. I appreciate that.
Sure. Should I jump right on?
Yeah.
okay.
Follow up on that.
I apologize. I'm unable to turn on my camera. I feel like it's rude not to have it on, but I'm fully present. The kind of question that I had while you were speaking, I mean, I find your work to be totally fascinating in the relationship between this development of a cultural identity and landscape through Roberto Burleigh Marx and a dictatorship, but it also seems like he was able to move pretty freely in determining his own expression, not just for sort of the country, but what that expression might be through painting. And I know he was very influenced he was an artist and influenced by folk textiles and, you know, Cubism and all sorts of things. And it just, I mean, his style is so incredibly distinct. I mean, it works as a painting, it works as a landscape, it works at so many different levels. I think he's the only landscape architect that I know of who plants en masse, like one species in this giant swath, and is convinced of the ecological value of it. But I wonder if the fact that the medium of landscape provided him a sense of freedom or independence from these other tensions and conversations about, you know, the Brazilian identity under the dictatorship.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting reflection for sure. I feel like he was essentially an outsider on many levels, and landscape kind of not even really being a profession in Brazil, even now, barely. I mean, he really did see, he was probably perceived as marginal in some ways, which gave him freedom, right? And I think for, you know, often there's like within that kind of marginal space, there are more things one can do. It's very interesting. But I think that to kind of echo on that question about like the, you know, the city, housing, and the landscape, I find his work, he was very much invested with these ideas of integrating the landscape into housing for 2 decades and then stops. And so I think that there's also this really interesting way of not seeing this division between like a kind of McCargian, this is where we put the watershed, this is where we put the buildings, but I think he was able to kind of see this as more blended and really engaged in that. Like, how would people live in this kind of new type of housing, which was not dissimilar in some ways to the work that Charles is looking at in New York and the textile union housing, for example, and thinking about how there's like housing actually offers this opportunity to bring this synthesizing the landscape more fluidly, even in the city, in some ways, that kind of larger platform. So I think it's a very interesting question. And even the Pedregulio project is a crazy one because it's on this really steep hill. And so it's a very difficult place to build anyway, but it kind of it really foregrounds the nature of the landscape around it. And I think that's also a kind of very interesting case in which the landscape and the housing are synthetic in a really powerful way that doesn't happen in his later work.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time. And I can't wait to read your book. I haven't yet, confession, nor have I read your book yet, Charles, but it's on my list, and totally both major contributions to both fields and the world.
Catherine, I'm wondering if you know, I've read portions of the book, but not as deeply as I would like. So I'm asking sort of out of ignorance, but I'm wondering if you detect either a kind of class bias or racial bias in the ways that Burle Marx is thinking of landscape and its value. I mean, like in some ways, I'm thinking of the ways that like preservation in America has, you know, it started off this kind of socialite practice and as a way of bettering society, but even in the 19th century, you get folks who are naturalists who really believe that, you know, to understand our particularity, racial particularity, national particularity, we need to preserve the landscape. There's something, there's a portrait of that tells us like what the best of us is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a kind of like, even in the language when people talk about nature, there's a kind of miscegenation or marginalization of it. And so I'm wondering if there's like in this notion of keeping the landscape pure, you can read a kind of anti-miscegenation, you know, a kind of class or racial reading of the landscape in this kind of elite artistic discourse.
Yeah, I think it's definitely there. I mean, I'm thinking back through, I focus quite a bit on like the history of the occupation of Brazil by the Portuguese. So the book kind of starts in 1809, but I think what's really interesting, yes, for sure. I mean, the military dictatorship was supported by the elites. I mean, it was the best in their best interest. And so I think you have automatically kind of built into that period, the appointment of those federal cultural counselors were from the elite who were supportive of the regime. And I think, you know, that's just, you know, not always directly said, but this was, you know, not, it was not a secret at all. I mean, there was very much a kind of, and Brazil is extremely classist, very transparently classist culture to this day. And so I think that, you know, people actually are like anthropologists, like I'm classy A, you're classy B, you're classy C, D, and E, you know. So there's a very clear hierarchy. There's very little movement. And of course, that was all, you know, it's through the educational system, et cetera. So yeah, I do think that there is this, this kind of elite or this refinement of like the protection of the landscape is to keep out other possibilities of land use for sure. And I think that's really what plays out in his kind of anti-housing depositions later in the 70s. But I think that there's certainly a kind of, I'm trying to remember which deposition. There's one where he speaks about he's speaking about a place in Minas Gerais which he hasn't seen in 20 years. And it's like, you know, it's not what it used to be, as I was mentioning earlier. And he describes like, even then we still saw some indigenous peoples in this valley, you know, and he kind of speaks to like, that actually made it authentic in this really weird way, right? So he's saying like, that's gone now. So that is also quite, it's quite disturbing on many levels. But I think the other element that we see, and this plays out again, like this theory I have about like the images tell us a lot. Like when you look at these historical images, some are in the book, of these expeditions, right? So again, part of the kind of the creation of the nation of Brazil, or the kind of the building of the state, was to reach out into all these places, the hinterland, where no one had been. And so there's, you know, Amazon expedition after Amazon expedition, and all of these expeditions go in, they other those who are living there, who know the place well. So you see a lot, and even to the level of labor, which I think I would love to kind of think further and deeper about, who builds these landscapes, who builds these highways, who's building these telegraph lines in the Amazon. And you look at the photographs, because amazingly, these expeditions always came with a botanist, a scientist, and a photographer and a filmmaker, right? So they weren't just about like, where's the border between us and Peru. It's more about like, let's just like make this a scientific exploration at all levels. And you can find these images of the building of the laying of the telegraph line, the famous Rondon expedition. You see who's building the line, and you see who's overseeing the work, and it's transparent. I mean, you know, it's very, very clear of who's actually doing the labor and who is doing the recording of the exploration, as it were.
So I'll just add briefly, because it's starting to come up in my own work, and I don't know how relevant it is for yours, but the ways that food culture transforms these things and allows for a kind of ephemeral transformation of this fixity that one looks for in this kind of colonial context. There's a way that like it allows for the breakdown of this that is passed on from one generation to the next. Often the laborers and those who have access to those things, we're using it in ways that aren't intended, that defy the kind of perfect categorization of it. And I kind of wonder whether any of that is present there in that work. Like I'm thinking also of like in the Frank Lloyd Wright case, the ways that some of the servants in the house would use the plants collected for their own purposes, which is different than the way the Victorians and the bourgeois would want it used in their spaces. And there's a kind of departure in the kind of ways that the class and the cultural elements allow for these things to happen, but they coexist. And sometimes they just disappear. They're not in the landscape, but they're in the use of those elements.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about houseplants. Like one of my favorite, it's not in the book, but there's a really funny, I mean, these depositions are often really funny. Like he has kind of the crazy way of saying things. But he really kind of goes off on this, like, I can't believe it. You know, everybody's just using plastic plants everywhere. Everywhere I go, the plants are made of plastic. It's the worst thing. And so he's kind of maligning, a consumer that can't afford, to have the upkeep, the maintenance of live plants, and has kind of decorated their homes with plastic plants. And he just can't handle it. It's very funny. And so you start to see that kind of class stuff and snobism play out. All this said, I mean, he's a marginal figure. His parents are not with 16 Portuguese last names. He's not from the 8 ruling families that run the entire country. He's a son of immigrants, and he comes from a very, his father was Jewish immigrant from Germany, and his mother is a Catholic immigrant from Holland. And so there's a very kind of, he's in a strange place. I think he's always trying to kind of place himself, and he has a kind of once in a while he'll relate this situation. He's like, when I come to the door, nobody knew, like, is he the gardener? Which should he come in, the front door or the back door? Who is Burle Marx? Is he like the front door or the back door? And so again, I think there was this kind of question of like his space being one of a kind of marginal position gave him some freedoms and abilities to say things that others probably could not have said.
Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your exquisite scholarship, dismantling this structuralist relationality, these incredible ethics built on elitist ideas. The way that each of you have kind of pulled these things apart has been so extraordinary and helpful, I think, for us to only do better in the future. At least I hope so. So on behalf of UNM, on behalf of the entire jury for the OTB, thank you so much for your contributions to our scholarship and for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Kathy. This was great. And thank you, Charles. It was great to be with you today.
Yes, thank you for hosting this.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining as well. Have a great evening.
Great. Good night, everyone.